They said her dance was a sin. By sunrise, they were already measuring the height of the rope, and no one asked why she danced at all. Before we go further, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And if you believe truth doesn't always speak loud, stay with this story. The desert air still held the night's chill, a dry cold that clung to the skin like dust, and the town of Red Hollow sat quiet under a pale sky. Wooden buildings casting long shadows across the street, as if even the sun hesitated to rise on what had been decided. Ethan Cole stood just beyond the edge of town, boots planted in the hard-packed dirt, one hand resting lightly against his horse's neck, watching the place wake up slow, like it always did. But something felt different this morning, heavier, like the wind carried more than just sand. He had seen her the night before, though he doubted anyone else had truly looked, not the way he did. She had been alone out past the last fence post, where the land opened into miles of empty scrub and broken stone, moving beneath the moon in a way that didn't belong to this town or its rules. Her feet traced circles in the dust, careful, measured, never hurried, and the faint glint of a turquoise pendant at her throat caught the moonlight with every turn, flashing like a signal no one else could read. Most would have called it strange and left it at that. But Ethan had stayed longer than he meant to, watching the pattern repeat, shift, then repeat again, like a map drawn without ink. He didn't understand it, not yet, but he knew it wasn't random, and out here, nothing that precise ever was. By morning, the story had already changed shape. What had been a quiet dance under the sky became something else in the mouths of the townsfolk, something improper, something threatening, something they could name and condemn without ever stepping foot outside their own fear. Women stood in small clusters by the general store, whispering behind gloved hands. Men leaned against hitching posts with narrowed eyes, speaking low but certain, as if certainty itself made them right. No one mentioned the pattern. No one spoke about the ground she traced or the direction she faced when the wind shifted. They only spoke about what they thought they saw, and what they thought they saw was enough. Ethan said nothing. He rarely did. Instead, he walked the edge of where she had been, boots pressing into the faint marks left behind, nearly erased now by the morning breeze, but not gone, not completely. He crouched once, running his fingers lightly over the dust, feeling the shallow grooves, the turns, the pauses. There was intention here, more than performance, more than defiance. Something deliberate, something that asked to be followed, not judged. The sound of hammering drifted from the center of town, dull and steady, wood against wood, each strike echoing farther than it should have in the still air. Ethan didn't need to look to know what they were building. Red Hollow had done this before, not often, but enough that the rhythm of it had a familiarity he didn't like. Structures went up fast when people believed they were right, faster when they didn't want to think too hard about it. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his hands, eyes moving from the fading marks on the ground back toward the town, where voices were rising now, sharper, more certain, like a decision had already been made and all that remained was carrying it out. Somewhere behind those voices, someone mentioned a missing child, the words slipping through the noise just enough to catch, just enough to settle heavy in the chest. Ethan's gaze shifted back to the pattern in the dirt, to the direction the circles opened toward, to the way the lines stretched slightly farther on one side, pointing out past the ridge where the land broke into narrow canyons and hidden drops. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he realizes something important before anyone else does, and knows it won't be easy to prove. Behind him, the hammering stopped, replaced by the low murmur of a crowd gathering, feet scuffing against dirt, voices pressing closer together. Ethan didn't turn yet. Instead, he looked once more at the last trace of her steps before the wind took them completely, and in that fading pattern, he saw not defiance, not sin, but direction, and somewhere far beyond the ridge, where the land swallowed sound and light, something, or someone, was waiting to be found. The crowd gathered faster than the sun could climb, boots scraping the dirt, voices stacking over one another until the air itself felt crowded. And at the center of it all stood the woman, her hands at her sides, her posture calm in a way that unsettled people more than fear ever could. Ethan Cole remained at the edge, where he always chose to stand, watching not the noise but the details, because noise lied and details did not. The wooden frame in the middle of the street was nearly finished now. Rough beams set into place with a kind of urgency that came from certainty rather than justice, and men who had once argued over cattle prices now spoke with the same voice, as if they had all decided the same truth at the same moment. The sheriff wiped his brow with the back of his hand, eyes avoiding the woman as much as possible, because it was easier to follow the crowd than to meet her gaze. She did not plead, did not speak, did not try to explain herself in a language they would accept, and that silence became its own accusation in the minds of those who needed someone. In the crowd mentioned the missing child again, louder this time, and the words spread like wine through dry grass, filling the gaps where doubt might have lived. Ethan's eyes shifted to her neck, to the turquoise pendant that had caught the moonlight the night before, and now, in the hard daylight, it looked different, not bright, but strained, a faint line running through the stone like something inside it had been pushed too far. He remembered the pattern again, the way her steps had curved and stretched, the direction they leaned toward the ridge, and he looked past the crowd, past the buildings, toward that same horizon where the land broke into uneven shadows. The sheriff cleared his throat, speaking words that sounded official but felt hollow, repeating what had already been decided long before he opened his mouth. Ethan took a step forward, then stopped, because timing mattered more than movement, and he was not yet certain how much time was left. The woman turned her head, slightly, just enough for her eyes to pass over the crowd and land, for the briefest moment, on him. There was no fear there, only a quiet urgency, like someone waiting for a storm they knew would come whether anyone else believed it or not. The pendant at her throat gave a soft crack, barely audible, but Ethan heard it, and that was enough. He turned without a word, boots cutting through the edge of the crowd before anyone noticed he was gone, and by the time the first rope was lifted into place, he was already in the saddle, already pushing his horse toward the ridge. The land opened quickly, the town shrinking behind him with every stride, replaced by dry brush, scattered rock, and the kind of silence that made a man listen harder. Ethan did not ride blind. He followed the memory of her movement, the angles of her steps, the way the pattern had leaned toward a specific line in the distance, and when he reached the ridge, he slowed, letting his horse pick its way down the narrow path that twisted into the canyon below. The air shifted there, cooler, heavier, carrying the faint echo of something that did not belong to the wind. And Ethan leaned forward in the saddle, eyes scanning the stone walls, the shadows between them, the places where something small could be hidden from anyone who did not know where to look. He dismounted near a cluster of rocks that matched the final curve he remembered, his boots landing soft against the ground as he listened, not for noise, but for absence, for the kind of quiet that meant something was being held just out of sight. Then he saw it, not movement, not at first, but a small shape caught between two slabs of stone, barely visible unless you stood exactly where the pattern would have led you. He moved closer, careful, steady, and the shape resolved into the missing child, trapped but unharmed, eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from being alone too long. Ethan did not rush. He did not speak loudly. He simply knelt, offering a steady hand, the way you approach something fragile without breaking it. And after a moment that stretched longer than it should have, the child reached back, miles away. In the center of Red Hollow, the crowd waited for something final, something that would make their certainty feel complete. But certainty has a way of breaking when truth arrives without warning. And as Ethan lifted the child and turned back toward the town, the wind shifted again, carrying dust across the empty pattern where her steps had once been, erasing the last trace of what they had failed to see. By the time Ethan Cole reached the edge of Red Hollow again, the sun had climbed high enough to burn the last of the morning chill from the air, and the town had grown quiet in a way that only happens when people believe they are about to witness something final. Dust drifted low across the street, catching in the light, softening the hard lines of the wooden buildings and the rough frames standing at the center of it all, where the woman still stood, unchanged, as if time had chosen to move around her instead of through her. The crowd parted slowly when they saw Ethan approach, not out of respect, but out of confusion, because he had left without a word and returned with something they had already decided was gone. The child rested in his arms, small against the broad lines of his coat, eyes half hidden but unmistakably alive. And for a moment no one spoke, not the sheriff, not the men who had raised the beams, not the women who had whispered certainty into the morning. Ethan did not hurry, did not raise his voice. He simply walked forward until he reached the center, until the distance between truth and judgment was too small to ignore, and then he bent slightly and set the child down on solid ground, steady, careful, the way a man handles something that matters. The silence that followed did not break. It deepened, pressing against every person standing there, because silence has weight when it replaces something louder. The sheriff's hand slipped from where it had, rested near his belt, his shoulders lowering just enough to show the crack in his certainty. And someone near the back shifted their stance, boots scraping the dirt in a sound that felt too loud for the moment. The child looked around, blinking in the sunlight, then turned toward the woman, and in that small movement, something passed between them that did not need words, something understood without explanation. Ethan straightened slowly, his gaze moving once across the crowd, not accusing, not demanding, just present, and then settling for a brief second on the woman herself. The turquoise pendant at her throat had split further now, a fine line running through its center, no longer whole, but still holding together, as if it had done what it was meant to do and paid its price in the process. No one asked him where he had found the child, not at first, because the answer had already begun to form in their minds, pieced together from what they had ignored, what they had dismissed, what they had been too quick to name as something else. The sheriff cleared his throat again, but this time no words came, and the rope that had been prepared hung untouched, swaying slightly in a breeze that had returned as quietly as it had left. The woman lifted her hand then, not toward the crowd, not toward the structure they had built, but to the pendant, her fingers resting against the cracked stone for just a moment before she slipped it free and held it loosely in her palm. She did not look at them as she stepped down, did not wait for permission, because none had been given when it mattered. She walked past Ethan without stopping, her steps steady, the same quiet rhythm he had seen under the moon, though now there was no pattern left to follow, no marks left in the dust to guide anyone else. When she reached the edge of town, she paused just once, placing the broken pendant on the ground beside the road, not as an offering, not as a message, but as something left behind because it no longer belonged to her. The crowd watched, unmoving, as she continued past the last fence post and into the open land beyond, where the horizon swallowed her slowly until there was nothing left but heat and distance. Behind them, the structure in the center of town stood unfinished in a way that no hammer could fix, and one by one, without instruction, without command, people began to step back, then turn, then leave, carrying with them a silence that would last far longer than any words they might have spoken. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, his eyes resting on the small piece of turquoise in the dust. Then he looked toward the ridge, toward the place where the pattern had begun, and then toward the path she had taken away from them, and without a word, he turned his horse and followed the direction of the wind, leaving behind a town that would remember not what they had built that morning, but what they had almost done. The wind carried her absence farther than her footsteps ever could, stretching across the open land until even the memory of her shape began to blur into the heat. But Ethan Cole did not ride fast, because some truths were not meant to be chased, only followed. His horse moved steady beneath him, hooves pressing into dry earth that gave nothing back but dust, and the silence ahead felt different from the silence he had left behind, lighter somehow, as if it had not yet been weighed down by judgment. Behind him, Red Hollow had already begun to settle into a version of itself that would pretend this morning had not happened, that the structure in the center of town had never been raised with such certainty, that the rope had never been tied with hands that did not question themselves. People would return to their routines, to ledgers and fences and small conversations that avoided the one thing they all now shared, a knowing that sat too close to the surface. But Ethan did not look back, because the past had a way of staying whether you faced it or not, and what mattered now lay somewhere ahead, in the direction she had chosen without asking anyone's permission. The land began to change as he rode, the flat stretches giving way to uneven ground, patches of sagebrush breaking the monotony, the scent of it sharp in the dry air, and in the distance, The outline of low hills rose like quiet witnesses that had seen far more than any town ever would. He slowed when he reached the place where the road faded into little more than a suggestion, where tracks became harder to follow unless you knew what to look for, and he dismounted, letting the reins hang loose as he stepped forward, eyes scanning not for footprints alone, but for intention, for the subtle shifts in the ground that spoke of someone who moved with purpose rather than haste. He found it after a moment, not a clear trail, but a pattern in absence. The way certain stones had been avoided, the way the brush bent slightly in one direction, the way the dust had been disturbed just enough to suggest passage without announcing it. It was the same kind of language she had spoken with her steps the night before, a quiet conversation between movement and meaning, and Ethan followed it without needing to understand every word. The sun climbed higher, the heat pressing down in a way that made time feel slower, stretching each moment into something longer than it should have been, and still he continued, not driven by urgency now, but by something steadier, something that did not rush because it did not need to. After a while, the land opened again, revealing a shallow valley tucked between the low hills, a place where the wind softened and the light shifted just enough to make the ground look less harsh. And there, near the edge of a narrow stream that cut through the earth like a quiet line, he saw her. She stood with her back to him, still as the stones around her, her gaze fixed on the water as it moved slow and steady over smooth rock, and for a moment, Ethan did not speak, because the scene held a kind of balance that words might break. The absence of the pendant at her throat was the first thing he noticed, the space it had occupied now empty, as if something important had been set down and left behind with purpose. He stepped closer, boots quiet against the ground, and the faint sound of water filled the space between them, a steady rhythm that did not demand attention but rewarded it. She did not turn when he approached, but she knew he was there, the slight shift in her posture enough to show awareness without acknowledgement. Ethan stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to remain respectful of a boundary he did not need to see to understand. For a long moment, neither of them said anything, and in that silence, there was no tension, no expectation, only a shared understanding that some things did not require explanation. Finally, she moved, bending slightly to pick up a small stone from the edge of the stream, turning it once in her hand before letting it fall back into the water, where it disappeared beneath the surface without a sound. Ethan watched the ripples fade, then lifted his gaze back to her, and when she turned at last, her eyes met his with a calm that held neither gratitude nor resentment, only clarity. He did not ask why she had done what she did not ask about the pattern or the pendant or the reason she had chosen to leave without a word, because he understood now that the answers had already been given, just not in the way the town had expected. Instead, he gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged what had been seen without claiming ownership of it, and after a moment, she returned it, just as slight, just as quiet. Then she turned back, toward the open land beyond the valley, stepping away from the stream and into the path that led farther from everything Red Hollow believed itself to be. And this time, Ethan did not follow, because not every truth needed a witness to remain true. He stood there as she walked, watching until distance took her again, until the line between presence and memory blurred once more. And when she was gone, he looked down at the water, at the place where the stone had disappeared, and then back toward the horizon, where the wind moved without asking, carrying with it the kind of silence that did not weigh heavy, but simply existed, waiting for someone willing to listen. When Ethan Cole turned back from the valley, the light had shifted again, the kind of late afternoon glow that softened edges and stretched shadows long across the land. And for a moment, everything looked quieter than it truly was, as if the world itself had decided to lower its voice. He mounted without hurry, guiding his horse along the same path he had taken in, though now the ground felt different beneath him, not because it had changed, but because he had, and the same dust that once carried questions now carried something closer to understanding. The ride back to Red Hollow took longer than it should have, not in distance, but in thought, each step of the horse marking time in a way that gave space for reflection, and Ethan did not try to fill that space, because some realizations needed silence to settle properly. When the town finally came into view, it looked the same from a distance, the same line of wooden buildings, the same narrow streets. But as he drew closer, the difference revealed itself in what was missing. The structure in the center had been taken down, not completely, but enough to show hesitation. Beams leaned against walls, tools left where they had been dropped, as if no one wanted to claim responsibility for finishing or undoing what had begun. People moved slower now, conversations shorter, eyes avoiding one another just enough to suggest that something shared had not yet been spoken aloud. Ethan rode through without stopping, the sound of hooves against dirt drawing quiet attention, not the kind that greeted a man, but the kind that followed him, measuring, reconsidering, and though no one called out, he felt their gaze linger longer than before. Near the edge of town, by the same place where the woman had left the broken pendant, something had changed again. The small piece of turquoise was no longer lying in the open dust, but had been moved, set carefully on top of a flat stone, not hidden, not displayed, simply placed with intention. Ethan slowed, then dismounted, stepping closer to look at it. The crack through its center more visible now in the fading light, a reminder of something that had done its work and no longer needed to prove itself. He did not touch it at first, only stood there, considering the quiet decision someone had made to lift it from the ground and give it a place, however small, however unspoken. Behind him, the sound of footsteps approached, hesitant, uneven, and when Ethan turned slightly, he saw the child standing there, the same one he had carried from the canyon, now clean, now steady on his feet, but still holding something of that earlier silence in his eyes. The boy looked at the stone, then at Ethan, as if searching for permission that was not needed, and after a moment, he stepped forward and placed his small hand over the turquoise piece, not to take it, but to feel it, to understand it in the only way he could. Ethan watched, saying nothing, because this was not his moment to explain, and the boy did not ask for explanation. He only nodded once, as if something inside him had settled into place. The footsteps behind them grew, not louder, but more numerous, and one by one, people from the town began to gather, not in a crowd like before, not with raised voices or certain claims, but quietly, uncertainly, forming a circle that held no center, only a shared presence. No one spoke at first, and when someone finally did, it was not to accuse or defend, but simply to say, "We were wrong." The words soft, almost lost in the open air, but heard by everyone there because they had been waiting for them without knowing it. Ethan did not respond, did not acknowledge the statement with anything more than a slight shift of his stance, because acknowledgement was not what mattered. Understanding was, and that had to come from each of them, not from him. The sheriff stood at the edge of the group, hat in hand, his usual authority replaced by something quieter, something closer to reflection, and though he did not step forward, his presence was enough to show that even those who had led the certainty were now learning to stand without it. The sun dipped lower, casting the town in a deeper shade, and as the light faded, people began to leave, not in haste, not in relief, but in a kind of calm that came from having faced something difficult and not turning away from it. The boy remained a moment longer, his hand still resting near the stone. Then he looked up at Ethan again, not with fear, not with confusion, but with a clarity that had not been there before, and without a word, he stepped back, giving the small piece of turquoise the same quiet respect it had been given when it was placed there. Ethan waited until the last of the footsteps had faded, until the town had returned to its slower rhythm, and then he reached down and picked up the pendant, holding it in his palm for a brief moment, feeling its weight, its fracture, its purpose, before setting it back exactly where it had been, because some things were not meant to be carried away, only remembered. He turned then, leading his horse past the edge of town, not toward the valley this time, not toward the place where she had disappeared, but along the open road that stretched beyond Red Hollow, because the lesson left behind was not tied to one direction, but to every step taken after. And as the night began to settle once more over the land, the wind moved gently through the quiet streets, carrying with it no judgment, no accusation, only the kind of silence that comes when people finally learn to listen. Night settled over Red Hollow with a gentleness the town had not earned, the kind of quiet that did not accuse but did not forget either. and the lanterns along the street flickered one by one, their lights soft against the wood and dust, as if trying to make peace with what the day had nearly become. Ethan Cole sat on the porch of his small ranch house just beyond the last fence line, boots stretched out, hat resting low, listening to the wind move through the dry grass in slow, steady waves. And for the first time in a long while, the silence around him did not feel empty. It felt full, as if it carried something that had finally found its place. Earlier that evening, he had seen small changes, the kind most men would overlook. A bucket left outside a neighbor's door filled with fresh water without anyone claiming it. A piece of bread set quietly on a windowsill where the boy lived, not offered with words, but left where it would be found. Gestures that spoke without drawing attention to themselves, and Ethan recognized them for what they were, not apologies, not quite, but something close, something beginning. The town was learning, not through speeches or proclamations, but through small acts that did not ask to be noticed. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, eyes tracing the line where the land met the sky, now dark and wide, scattered with stars that held steady in a way people rarely did. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the towns, fences and names, she was walking still, moving with the same quiet purpose that had brought her through and taken her away, and Ethan wondered, not where she was, but whether she had ever expected to be understood at all. He suspected she had not, and that thought settled deeper than anything else, because it meant what had happened today had not been for her, not entirely. It had been for them, for the ones who stayed behind, for the ones who would carry the memory longer than she ever would. A faint sound reached him from the direction of town, not loud, not urgent, just the distant murmur of voices, softer now, less certain, and he imagined the conversations taking place, men and women speaking, in lower tones, not to convince each other anymore, but to make sense of what they had nearly done, and in that effort, there was something honest, something that might hold. He stood after a while, stepping down from the porch, boots meeting the dirt with a quiet weight, and walked to the fence, resting his hand on the top rail, feeling the rough wood beneath his palm, familiar, steady, unchanged. Beyond it, the land stretched open, a wide, dark expanse that did not belong to anyone, and yet held room for everyone willing to move through it without claiming it. He stayed there for a long moment, then turned back toward the house, pausing only once as a small figure approached from the road. The boy again, moving carefully, as if unsure whether he should come this far. Ethan did not call out, did not wave. He simply waited, and when the boy reached the fence, he stopped, looking up with the same clear eyes that had begun to change earlier that day. In his hands, he carried something, wrapped in cloth, and after a brief hesitation, he lifted it slightly, offering it forward without stepping closer. Ethan reached out, taking the bundle, unwrapping it slowly to reveal the turquoise pendant, the cracks still visible, but now bound gently with a thin strip of leather, not to hide the fracture, but to hold it together. He glanced at the boy, who shrugged lightly, as if to say it seemed like the right thing to do, and Ethan nodded once, understanding that some things did not need to be fixed completely to still have meaning. He handed it back, closing the boy's fingers around it, because it no longer belonged to the ground, nor to him, and perhaps not even to the one who had left it, but to the lesson it carried forward. The boy held it carefully, then turned and walked back toward the town, his steps small but steady, and Ethan watched until he disappeared into the dim glow of lantern light. When he finally stepped inside, the room felt the same as always, simple, quiet, but something had shifted, something that did not change the walls or the roof, but changed the space within them. He set his hat down, poured a small measure of water into a tin cup, and stood by the window, looking out once more at the dark line of the horizon. Out there, the wind continued to move without judgment, the land remained wide without boundaries, and somewhere between those two truths, a story had passed through Red Hollow, leaving behind no mark that could be pointed to, only a change that could be felt. Ethan lifted the cup slightly, not in a toast, not in ceremony, just an acknowledgement of something that had come and gone without asking permission, and then he drank, setting the cup down, with a soft sound that faded quickly into the night, leaving only the quiet behind, steady, patient, and finally understood. Morning returned to Red Hollow without announcement. the sky pale and stretched thin across the horizon, as if the land itself had taken a careful breath and chosen not to release it too quickly. And the town woke slower than usual, not from fatigue, but from something quieter, something that asked people to move with more thought than habit. Doors opened with less force, footsteps carried less certainty, and even the usual clatter of buckets and tools seemed softened, as if every sound passed through a layer of reflection before it reached the air. Ethan Cole stepped out onto his porch as the first light touched the fence posts, his gaze steady, taking in the same view he had seen for years, but measuring it differently now, not for what it was, but for what had shifted within it. He noticed the boy again, earlier than expected, standing near the edge of the road with the turquoise pendant tied carefully around his neck with that same thin strip of leather, the cracked stone resting against his chest as if it had found a new purpose there, not as something broken, but as something carried. The boy did not approach this time, did not need to. He simply lifted a hand in a small gesture that held both recognition and something else, something closer to understanding, and Ethan returned it with a nod, because some exchanges required no more than that. Farther into town, a few people had already begun their work, but the rhythm was different, less hurried, less sharp, and as Ethan walked toward the main street, he saw small changes that would have gone unnoticed days ago. A man repairing a section of fence for a neighbor without being asked. A woman sweeping not just her own doorstep but the space in front of another building as well. Acts that did not erase what had happened, but leaned quietly in another direction. Near the center of town, where the unfinished structure had stood, the ground had been cleared completely now. No beams, no rope, nothing left to point at what had nearly taken place. Only a smooth stretch of dirt that looked ordinary to anyone who had not been there. And perhaps that was the point, not to forget, but to remove the need for reminders that could be mistaken for something else. The sheriff stood nearby, hat set firmly on his head this time, but his posture held less weight than before, and when his eyes met Ethan's, there was no authority in the glance, only acknowledgement, the kind that passes between men who have both seen something they cannot easily name. Ethan did not stop to speak, because there was nothing to say that would not sound smaller than the silence they already understood. He continued past the buildings, past the familiar corners where conversations used to gather without thought, and out toward the edge of town where the land opened again, because that was where his place had always been, not in the center of things, but just beyond them. The wind had returned, steady and low, moving across the ground in long, even lines that carried the scent of dust and sage. And Ethan paused at the same spot where the pendant had once rested on the stone, noticing that the stone remained, but the space above it was empty now, not abandoned, but completed, as if its purpose had already been fulfilled. He crouched for a moment, brushing his fingers lightly across the surface, then stood again, letting his hand fall back to his side, because there was nothing left to take or leave behind. In the distance, a rider passed along the far ridge, too far to make out clearly, but the movement caught his eye, and for a brief moment, the line of the figure against the sky carried a familiarity that did not need confirmation. Ethan watched without following, without calling out, because not every crossing of paths required recognition, and some stories were not meant to return once they had passed through. The rider continued along the ridge, steady, unhurried, and then disappeared beyond the slope, leaving nothing but the open line of the horizon behind. Ethan remained there for a while longer, the wind pressing lightly against his coat, the sun climbing higher with a quiet certainty that did not need to announce itself. And when he finally turned back toward his ranch, his steps carried the same steadiness, the same quiet purpose, but without the weight he had carried before. Behind him, Red Hollow moved forward in small ways, not loudly, not perfectly, but differently. And sometimes that was enough. The land did not change, the sky did not lower itself to meet anyone halfway, but something in the space between them had shifted, something that would not be spoken of often, but would be felt in the way people chose their actions when no one was watching. Ethan reached his porch again, resting his hand briefly on the worn wood of the railing, then stepping inside as the day settled fully into place. And outside, the wind continued its steady path, across the open ground, carrying no judgment, no memory, only movement, leaving it to those who remained to decide what they would carry forward and what they would finally learn to leave behind. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different, yet the difference settled into Red Hollow the way dust settles after a long ride, quietly, almost unnoticed at first, but impossible to ignore once it had found every corner. Mornings came with the same pale light stretching over the rooftops, the same creak of wood and distant call of cattle, but something in the way people moved had softened, as if each step now carried a question that had not been there before. Ethan Cole noticed it in the small pauses, the moments when a man would stop before speaking, weighing his words against something deeper than habit, or when a woman would look twice before turning away, as if seeing more than she once had. He did not speak of it, because naming it would make it smaller, and some changes needed space to remain what they were. The boy wore the turquoise pendant each day, the leather binding holding the cracked stone together, not hiding the fracture but honoring it, and the way he carried it was not with pride, not with display, but with a quiet understanding that it meant something. Beyond him, children in the town began to notice, asking questions in the way children do, direct and unguarded, and the answers they received were not always clear, but they were more honest than before, shaped less by fear and more by memory. The sheriff spent more time walking the streets without purpose, his presence no longer a symbol of control, but of observation, and when he spoke, it was with fewer words, each one placed carefully, as if he had learned that authority did not come from volume but from restraint. Ethan returned to his routine, tending to his land, checking the fences, moving through the day with the same steady rhythm he had always known. But even in that familiarity, there was a shift, a sense that the space around him had opened slightly, as if the horizon had moved just a little farther away. One evening, as the sun lowered itself behind the distant hills, painting the sky in slow shades of amber and gray, Ethan found himself standing at the edge of his property, looking out over the same stretch of land where the wind carried its quiet message without interruption. He had no reason to be there beyond the simple act of standing, of listening, and sometimes that was reason enough. The air held the scent of sage and dry earth, and the silence was not empty. It was layered, carrying echoes of what had passed and what remained. In the distance, along the faint line where the land met the sky, movement caught his eye again, not sudden, not dramatic. Just a figure crossing the ridge with the same steady pace he had seen before. He did not reach for his horse, did not step forward. He only watched, because he understood now that following was not always the answer, that some paths were meant to remain separate, not out of distance, but out of respect. The figure paused for a brief moment against the fading light, a silhouette that held no detail but carried a presence that did not need to be confirmed, and then it moved on, disappearing beyond the curve of the land as quietly as it had come. Ethan remained where he was, the wind brushing past him in slow, even waves, and for the first time, he did not wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently. He did not measure the day against what it might have been, because the answer no longer held weight. What mattered was what had been seen, what had been understood, and what would be carried forward without needing to be spoken aloud. Behind him, Red Hollow continued its quiet adjustment, not perfect, not complete, but moving, and that movement, however small, was enough. Ethan turned back toward his house as the last light faded from the sky, the first stars beginning to show in their steady, unchanging pattern, and as he stepped onto the porch, he paused once more, not out of hesitation, but out of acknowledgement, a silent recognition of something that had passed through his life without asking, leaving behind no mark he could point to, only a shift he could feel. He rested his hand on the worn wood of the railing, then stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him, and outside. The wind continued its path across the open land, carrying with it no judgment, no explanation, only the quiet truth that some things are not meant to be understood all at once, only lived, one step at a time. Time did not rush in Red Hollow after that. It stretched, it lingered, as if the land itself had decided to give the town space to become something different without forcing it. And the people, whether they realized it or not, began to move in rhythm with that slower pace. Ethan Cole noticed it in the way mornings no longer felt like a race to begin, but a quiet unfolding, each moment stepping into the next without urgency. Without the sharp edges that once defined them, the boy with the turquoise pendant had grown more certain in his steps, no longer lingering at the edges of spaces as if unsure whether he belonged, but walking through them with a quiet confidence that came not from pride, but from understanding. And the pendant, still cracked, still bound with that thin strip of leather, rested against his chest like a reminder that something broken could still guide. People began to greet him differently, not with the cautious curiosity of before, but with small nods, brief smiles, gestures that did not draw attention to themselves, but carried meaning nonetheless. Ethan watched all of this without inserting himself into it, because he understood that change, real change, did not come from a single moment, but from the way moments continued after that. One afternoon, as the sun hung high and the heat pressed down in steady waves, he found himself walking toward the far edge of town again, where the road thinned and the land opened, not because he expected anything to happen, but because something in him had learned to listen when the silence called. The wind moved differently that day, not stronger, not louder, but with a direction that felt intentional, brushing past him in a way that made him pause, as if it carried something unseen but understood. He stood there, hat low against the sun, eyes tracing the horizon where the ridge curved gently against the sky, and for a moment, there was nothing, only the wide, open stillness that defined this place. Then, just at the edge of that stillness, movement appeared again, distant, almost part of the land itself, but unmistakable once seen. The figure moved along the ridge with the same steady rhythm, neither approaching nor retreating, simply existing within the space it crossed. Ethan did not move toward it, did not call out, because he had learned that not every presence was meant to be answered. Some were meant to be acknowledged and allowed to pass. He stood there, letting the moment exist without trying to shape it, and in that stillness, something settled deeper within him, something that did not need explanation or confirmation. Behind him, Red Hollow carried on, the sounds of daily life, drifting faintly through the air, softened now, less demanding, as if the town itself had learned to lower its voice. A wagon rolled slowly down the main street, its wheels turning with a steady rhythm that matched the pace of everything else, and a few voices rose and fell in quiet conversation, not sharp, not hurried, just present. Ethan turned back after a while, his steps unhurried, his path clear without needing to be chosen, because he no longer walked with the same questions that had once guided him. When he reached the center of town, he paused briefly at the place where the structure had once stood, the ground now smooth, unmarked, holding no sign of what had nearly taken place. And yet, in that emptiness, there was a kind of presence, a memory that did not need form to remain. He stood there for a moment, then continued on, because staying too long in one place, even one filled with meaning, could turn reflection into something heavier than it needed to be. The boy passed him again, this time carrying a small bundle of wood, his steps steady, his gaze forward, and as they crossed paths, the boy gave a slight nod, not seeking approval, not offering thanks, simply acknowledging what was shared. Ethan returned it in kind, because that was enough. As the day moved toward evening, the lights softened once more, stretching shadows long across the dirt roads, and the wind carried its steady message across the open land, unchanged, impartial, constant. Ethan reached his ranch as the first hints of dusk settled in, the sky shifting slowly from gold to gray, and he paused at the gate, resting his hand against the worn wood, feeling the familiar texture beneath his palm. Beyond it, the land stretched wide and open, holding space for whatever might come and whatever might pass, and, for a moment, he allowed himself to stand there without thought, without expectation, simply present in the quiet that surrounded him. Somewhere far beyond the ridge, unseen but not forgotten, the path continued, and though he would not follow it, he understood now that it did not need to be followed to be real. He stepped through the gate then, closing it behind him with a soft, deliberate motion. And as the night settled once more over Red Hollow, the town did not return to what it had been, nor did it become something entirely new. It remained in between, in that quiet space where change lives before it is named. And in that space, something enduring had taken root, not loud, not visible, but steady, like the wind that never stopped moving, whether anyone chose to notice it or not. By the time the season began to shift, Red Hollow no longer felt like a place waiting for something to happen. It felt like a place that had already been changed and was learning how to live with it. And the change did not come in loud declarations or grand gestures. It lived in the quiet choices people made when no one was watching. Ethan Cole noticed it in the way the wind seemed less harsh against the buildings. Though he knew the wind had not changed at all. Only the way it was received had softened, and sometimes that was enough to make a place feel different. The days moved with a steady rhythm now, work done without rush, conversations held without edge, and though the memory of that morning still lingered, it no longer pressed heavily against every thought. It settled instead into something deeper, something that guided rather than accused. The boy had grown taller in the way children do when something inside them shifts, not in inches, but in presence, and the turquoise pendant, still marked by its fracture, had become a quiet symbol in the town, not of what had happened, but of what had been understood. People did not speak of it openly, but they noticed it, in the way the light caught it, in the way it rested against his chest as he moved through the streets, and in those small observations, a shared awareness continued to grow. Ethan found himself returning more often to the edge of his land, not searching, not expecting, but simply standing where the horizon stretched wide and unbroken, because it reminded him of something he could not quite name, something that did not belong to him, but had passed through his life all the same. One evening, as the sky lowered into a deep shade of blue and the first cool hint of night touched the air, he stood there again, hat low, hands resting loosely at his sides, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the open land and the steady movement of the wind. Then, as it had before, a figure appeared along the distant ridge, not sudden, not surprising, but familiar in a way that did not require confirmation. The movement was the same, measured, purposeful, neither approaching nor avoiding, simply existing within its own path, and Ethan watched without stepping forward, without calling out, because he understood now that presence did not always mean connection, and connection did not always require closeness. The figure paused briefly, just long enough to be seen. And though the distance made details impossible, there was no need for them. Because recognition did not live in details, it lived in something quieter, something that did not change with distance. After a moment, the figure continued, disappearing once more beyond the curve of the land, leaving behind only the open line of the horizon and the steady movement of the wind. Ethan remained where he was, not waiting for anything more, because there was nothing more to wait for, and that realization did not feel like loss. It felt like completion. Behind him, Red Hollow carried on, the soft sounds of evening settling into place, a door closing, a quiet laugh carried on the air, the low murmur of voices that no longer needed to rise above one another to be heard. The town had not become something new, not entirely, but it had become something more aware, something that paused before judging, that looked twice before turning away, and in that small shift, something lasting had taken root. Ethan turned back toward his house after a while, his steps steady, unhurried, the same as always, and yet not the same at all, because the weight he once carried had changed into something lighter, something that did not press down, but moved with him. As he reached the porch, he paused once more, not out of habit, but out of acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of the path that had crossed his own without asking, leaving behind no demand, no expectation, only a truth that had revealed itself in its own time. He rested his hand on the worn wood of the railing, feeling its familiar texture, then stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him. Outside, the night settled fully over the land, the stars steady in their distant places, the wind continuing its endless path across the open ground, carrying with it no judgment, no memory, only movement, and in that movement, a quiet certainty remained that not all truths arrive with force, some arrive in silence, and those are the ones that stay. The wind changed again as the weeks passed, not in strength, not in direction, but in how it was felt, as if the land itself had begun to carry memory differently, and Red Hollow no longer resisted it the way it once had. Ethan Cole noticed it in the quiet spaces between things, the way conversations now paused before turning sharp, The way eyes lingered just a moment longer before deciding what they saw. And though no one spoke of it directly, it lived in the town like a second rhythm beneath. The first, the boy with the turquoise pendant had grown into that rhythm, his steps steady, his voice no longer hesitant when he spoke, and sometimes, when the light caught the cracked stone just right, it would glint in a way that reminded Ethan of that night under the moon, not as a memory that pulled backward, but as one that moved forward, guiding without forcing. One afternoon, as the sky stretched wide and pale above the open land, Ethan found himself walking farther than usual, beyond the edge of his fence, beyond the familiar path that led into town, following no clear direction, only the quiet pull that had become easier to trust. The ground beneath his boots shifted from packed dirt to loose sand, then to scattered rock, each step marking a gradual change that did not announce itself, but could be felt all the same. He did not hurry, because he had learned that what mattered did not reveal itself to those who rushed toward it. The land opened ahead into a broad stretch of low hills, their slopes softened by distance, and the wind moved across them in long, even lines, carrying the faint scent of sage and something else, something older, something that did not belong to any one place. Ethan paused at the crest of a rise, his gaze moving slowly across the horizon, not searching, not expecting, simply observing, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the steady presence of the land itself. Then, as it had before, movement appeared, not sudden, not startling, but familiar, a figure crossing the far ridge with that same measured pace that had become part of the quiet language he now understood. He did not step forward, did not call out, because he knew now that this was not a moment meant to be interrupted. It was a moment meant to be witnessed, and even that word felt too heavy for what it truly was. The figure moved steadily, the distance between them unchanged, and for a brief instant, the light shifted just enough to catch the outline more clearly, the shape of a woman, the posture calm, the movement precise, and though there was no turquoise pendant at her throat now, no visible sign of what had once been carried, there was no need for it, because what it had represented had already been left behind where it needed to be. Ethan stood there, the wind brushing past him, carrying no message, no demand, only presence. And in that presence, something settled fully, something that had been building since the moment he first saw her steps in the dust. He understood now that what she had done had never been about being seen, never about being understood in the way the town expected. It had been about doing what needed to be done, whether anyone recognized it or not. And that kind of truth did not require acknowledgement to remain true. The figure paused for a moment at the far edge of the ridge, not turning, not signaling, simply standing in a way that felt complete, and then continued on, disappearing once more beyond the curve of the land. Ethan did not remain as long this time, because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to question, and that absence did not feel empty. It felt resolved. He turned back toward the direction of his ranch, his steps steady, the path beneath him familiar and yet newly understood, and as he walked, the wind continued its quiet movement. Across the land, unchanged, constant, carrying nothing and everything all at once. When he reached the edge of Red Hollow, the town looked the same as it always had, but he knew better than to trust appearances alone, because what mattered had never been in what could be seen. It had been in what had shifted beneath the surface. The boy passed him again, the pendant resting against his chest, and this time, there was no nod, no gesture, only a shared glance that held no question, no explanation, just recognition. Ethan stepped onto his porch as the day began to lower into evening, the light softening, the shadows stretching long across the ground, and he paused once more, not out of habit, but out of understanding, because some moments deserved to be marked, even if only in silence. He rested his hand against the railing, then stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him, and outside, the wind moved on, as it always had, as it always would, carrying with it no judgment, no memory, only the quiet certainty that the truth does not need to be spoken to be known, and once it is known, it does not need to return to remain. The seasons did not turn sharply in Red Hollow. They shifted the way breath shifts on a cold morning. Slow, almost unnoticed until the air feels different in the lungs. And with that change came a deeper quiet, not the kind that follows noise, but the kind that settles when something has finally been understood. Ethan Cole stood at the far edge of his land as the first hint of cooler wind moved across the open ground, carrying with it the scent of distant rain that might never reach this place. And he listened without expectation, because he had learned that not every sign was meant to lead. Some were meant simply to be felt. Behind him, the town had grown into its silence, not empty, not withdrawn, but steady, as if each person had found a place within it where they could stand without needing to fill the space with certainty. The boy moved through the streets with the same quiet confidence, the turquoise pendant still resting against his chest, the leather binding worn now from use, but holding firm. And sometimes, when he paused in the light, people would glance at it, not with curiosity anymore, but with recognition, the kind that does not ask questions because it already knows enough. Ethan had not spoken of that morning in a long time, not because he had forgotten, but because it no longer needed to be spoken. It lived in the way things were done now, in the way decisions were made with a fraction more care, a fraction more patience. One evening, as the sky lowered into a muted gray and the wind carried a softer tone, he walked beyond the fence line again, his steps guided not by habit, but by a quiet pull that had never quite left him. The land stretched wide before him, the same as always, and yet never the same twice, and he moved across it without hurry, his boots pressing into the ground in a rhythm that matched the steady movement of the wind. When he reached the rise that overlooked the distant ridge, he paused, not expecting anything, not searching, simply standing in the space where he had stood before, letting the moment exist without shaping it. The horizon remained still for a long time, the light fading slowly, the land holding its breath in that way it sometimes did just before night settled fully. And then, without warning and without surprise, movement appeared once more, a figure. Crossing the ridge, steady, unchanged, as if time had no hold over it. Ethan did not move, did not call out, because he understood now that this was not something to be reached, it was something to be accepted, something that existed whether he stood there or not. The figure moved with the same calm precision, the same quiet purpose, and for a brief moment, as the last light caught the line of the ridge, the shape became clear enough to confirm what had never truly needed confirming. She paused. Again, not turning, not acknowledging, simply existing in that space between presence and distance. And then she continued, disappearing once more beyond the curve of the land. Ethan remained where he was for a while longer, not because he was waiting, but because there was no reason to leave immediately. The moment did not demand anything of him. It simply offered itself and moved on. When he finally turned back, the night had begun to settle, the first stars appearing in their quiet, distant pattern, and the wind carried its steady path across the open ground, unchanged, impartial, constant. As he walked back toward Red Hollow, the faint glow of lanterns began to appear, small points of light that marked the presence of those who remained, and he felt no urgency to return, only a steady understanding that the place he was walking toward was no longer what it had been, and neither was he. When he reached the edge of town, he paused briefly, looking once more at the space where the structure had once stood, now just another part of the ground, indistinguishable to anyone who did not know. And perhaps that was the way it should be, not erased, but absorbed, not forgotten, but carried differently. The boy passed him again, the pendant catching a faint glint of starlight, and this time, there was no exchange at all, no nod, no glance, because none was needed. The understanding between them had moved beyond gestures into something quieter, something that did not require acknowledgement to exist. Ethan stepped onto his porch as the night deepened, the wood creaking softly beneath his boots, and he paused once more, not out of habit, but out of respect for the stillness that had settled into his life, a stillness that did not come from absence, but from clarity. He rested his hand against the railing, then stepped inside, the door closing gently behind him, and outside, the wind continued its endless path across the land, carrying with it no judgment, no explanation, only the quiet certainty that some stories do not end. They simply move beyond the places where they were first seen, leaving behind not answers, but a way of seeing that remains long after the figures have disappeared. Out here, no one announces when a story ends. It simply fades into the wind, and what remains is not the moment itself, but the way it changes the men who remember it. Red Hollow stood beneath a wide, quiet sky, unchanged to the eye, the same weathered buildings, the same dusty road stretching through its center, but something deeper had settled into its bones, something that would not leave even when time moved on. Ethan Cole stood at his porch one last time before the season turned fully, the air cooler now, the wind carrying a sharper edge that spoke of distant change, and he did not look toward the ridge, not this time, because he no longer needed to. The horizon had given him what it needed to give, and chasing it now would only make it smaller than it truly was. Behind him, the town moved in its quiet rhythm, steady, thoughtful, no longer quick to name what it did not understand. And that alone was enough to mark the passing of something important. The boy walked down the road. Again, the turquoise pendant resting against his chest, the cracks still visible, the leather binding worn but strong. And as he passed the center of town, he paused for just a moment, his hand brushing lightly against the stone as if acknowledging something that no longer needed to be explained. No one stopped him, no one questioned him, because they had all learned, in their own way, that some things were not meant to be questioned, only carried. Ethan stepped down from the porch, his boots meeting the ground with a quiet finality, and for a moment, he stood still, listening, not for anything specific, but for the absence of the weight he had once carried, and finding that it was gone. Not forgotten, not erased, but transformed into something lighter, something that moved with him instead of against him. He walked to the fence, resting his hand against the worn wood one last time, feeling the grooves left by years of weather and use, a reminder that time did not need to be dramatic to leave its mark. Beyond it, the land stretched open, endless, unchanged, and yet filled with a quiet meaning that had not been there before. The wind moved across it in long, steady lines, carrying no memory, no judgment, only motion. And Ethan understood now that this was what truth looked like when it did not need to prove itself. It simply existed, whether anyone saw it or not. He turned away from the horizon then, not because it had nothing left to offer, but because he had already received what he needed. And as he stepped back toward his house, his movement carried no hesitation, no question, only the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed answers to understand. The town behind him would continue, not perfect, not without mistakes, but different. And that difference would live in the small choices, the quiet pauses, the moments when someone chose to look again instead of turning away. The boy would grow, the pendant would age, the crack would remain, and in that imperfection, it would continue to remind those who saw it that what is broken is not always lost. Sometimes it is what holds everything together. Ethan reached his door, pausing only once more, not out of habit, but out of respect for the silence that had followed him all this way. A silence that was no longer empty, but full, steady, complete. He stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him, and outside, the wind continued its endless journey across the open land, carrying with it no trace of the story that had passed through. And yet, in the quiet way the town breathed, in the way a boy carried a broken stone, in the way a man no longer chased the horizon, the story remained, not spoken, not written, but lived, and out here, that was all the ending it ever needed.